Good morning and welcome to Life in Review. I'm Josefa Salinas, your host. The American Story, conversations with master historians. Immediately you're wondering who could possibly be in this book. Well, how about thoughts on John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Lyndon Johnson, and a whole lot more. David Rubenstied is the man who put this all together. David, good morning, and thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure to be here.
And I love the foreword by the Librarian of Congress, Carla Hayden. I'm actually a library commissioner here in Los Angeles.
Really?
So hearing from her was really wonderful.
Well, she is, as you probably know, she's the first woman to be Librarian of Congress, first African-American to be Librarian of Congress, and the first librarian in at least 60 years to be Librarian of Congress.
Well, that speaks volumes right there. So let's get right down to it. This book is an incredible collection of thoughts and analysis of democracy and history here in the United States. What made you decide to put this together? I see that you are a collector of fine memorabilia. You have put together so many incredible things that are now on display as a result of you making sure that we would have these original copies here, like the Magna Carta. And then you went on to get the Declaration of Independence, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the 13th Amendment, and placed them all on public display. Why this fascination and then desire to collect these things and preserve them for the American public?
Well, I came from very modest circumstances. My parents didn't graduate from high school, and I got lucky in my business career, and I wanted to give back to the country. I did work in the White House for President Carter, so I got a sense of history when I did that. And so when my business career worked out reasonably well, I decided to try to give back to the country by preserving these historic documents and by fixing historic monuments like the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial. The idea behind this book was this. I think it's important to know a lot about history because if you don't know about the past, you might make the same mistakes in the past in the future. So it's very important to really know what happened before. Sadly, we don't teach history in civics very much anymore. So, for example, a recent survey showed that 3/4 of Americans, 75%, cannot name the three branches of our government. 1/3 of Americans cannot even name one branch of government. And so I thought, who better to educate about history than members of Congress? So about 6 years ago, I started a program to educate members of Congress about history. Once a month, I have a dinner at the Library of Congress for members of Congress only, where I interview a great historian, Doris Kearns Goodwin, David McCullough, John Meacham, and so forth. I did one last night with David Blight on his book on Frederick Douglass. And members of Congress like it because they learn about history, and it's a chance for members of Congress to come together in a bipartisan setting. And so these interviews are 16 of the interviews that I did in front of members of Congress of these great historians.
Wow. So let's get down to some of the thoughts that might have come out of this. When we are talking about Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence, I know a lot of people are thinking, how could something have been written, all men are created equal? And I know that this is something that's addressed there. So how could that have been written knowing that he was a slaveholder?
Thomas Jefferson was 33 years old when he was at the Second Continental Congress. He really wanted to be back home with his ailing wife, but they importuned him to stay. He was asked by John Adams to write the Declaration of Independence. He had 17 days to do it. He did it in the last 3 days. Like most people, he put it off. He wrote it, and he wrote a sentence that became the most famous sentence in the English language. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, how could he write that when he had 2 slaves with him? He owned 200 other slaves. Well, his view was one of 2 things. We don't know for certain. Either he thought all men are created equal, and he didn't say women, but all men are created equal in a philosophical sense. They can not live together, perhaps, as blacks and whites might not be able to live together then, but they were created equally by God. The other sense is that maybe he just meant all white men are equal. Now, the reason that sentence is so famous is because it became the creed of our country. All men are created equal. Now, obviously, all men are not treated equally in this country and haven't been for so long, and all women are the same, but it was something we aspired to. And many countries around the world, when they were having their own revolutions, they would adopt the same principle: all men and all women are created equal. That's why the sentence became so famous. Jefferson was conflicted. He actually didn't like slavery, but he recognized that politically he couldn't survive if he was in favor of getting rid of slavery. And so he abandoned that effort many years earlier in his political career and basically lived with the system.
When you're talking about probably for the listening audience that we have here, that are many of them between I'd say in their 30s to their 50s,
Right.
People that they would remember, that stories that would mean something to them would be Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. Right. The Cuban Missile Crisis has always been fascinating. There's been movies about it. In your
Yes.
in some of your discussions and some of the information and different philosophies about why Kennedy did what he did or what really happened, what do you think happened during that Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, for those who may not be familiar with it, the Soviet Union placed long-range or intermediate ballistic missiles in Cuba, nuclear-headed missiles. So those nuclear missiles could go into the United States and kill 100 million or more Americans. When we found out about it, what should we do about it was the question, and the military people advised President Kennedy to go in to invade Cuba, but we were afraid that the missiles might be launched in the process of the invasion occurring. So ultimately he came up with a quarantine idea. No more missile parts would be going in, and the Russians would be forced to remove the existing missile, and nobody knew if that was going to happen or not. But ultimately the Soviet Union did blink. They took the missiles out, and it was seen as a great victory. In my own case, I was in the 8th grade then, and my teacher said, "I'm not giving you any homework because we're not going to be here tomorrow. We're going to be blown up."
Oh, geez.
Not a very reassuring thing.
Right.
But that's how bad it was, because remember, nuclear missiles could be launched in a few minutes from Cuba, and they would have probably killed 100 million Americans, and we, of course, would have retaliated against the Soviet Union, and we might have killed 100 million Soviets. So it was the closest the world has ever come to a nuclear confrontation, and we dodged the bullet just very briefly. Easily, I should say. Not easily.
Right. Do you think that in our current time, when you're looking at history like this and based on all of your conversations and research, are we back to a position where this could become a possibility again? I mean, we've heard this in the news recently about nuclear, talks and, positioning and
Right.
posturing. Are we back to that point again? I mean, could we get back to the point where on Saturday mornings at 9 a.m. a siren goes off and we all pretend to practice what we would do, which would really be useless, but practice
Right.
what you would do?
Well, in those days when I was in school, and we used to practice drills where you would go hide under your desk. Now, of course, radiation wouldn't have a difficulty getting around the top of the desk, so I don't know what good the hiding on your desk would have done. But in any event, I think to be serious about this, I don't think nuclear weapons can really be used, because we know that if you use a nuclear weapon against someone, you're going to be retaliated against, and so the chance of your surviving is very limited. So it's a kind of situation where you have what's called MAD, mutually assured destruction, which means if the Soviets were to launch something against us, or now the Russians or the North Koreans against us, they know that they would be wiped out by our nuclear weapons. So in effect, it's a checkmate. Nobody's really going to use them, in my view. It'd be better not to have them, but right now, no one's probably going to use them.
Is that why there is such a push towards keeping countries that might not necessarily care about being wiped out, that might think
Right.
that that's actually, the way to go, keep it from getting in their hands?
Well, of course, somebody crazy could always get a hold of these nuclear weapons and decide if he or she is about to be killed, they might kill other people. Secondly, you have the problem that governments might be responsible, but suppose you have a rogue actor, a terrorist that gets a hold of a nuclear weapon that isn't responsible and somehow could launch it in a rogue operation that you might not know who launched it, kill lots of people, and you might not be able to retaliate against them so easily. So that's one of the reasons you want to avoid the proliferation of nuclear weapons. But right now, I think countries that have them recognize that they're nice to have in the sense that they give you security, but it's very unlikely they'll be used by a country against another country.
Is there a common thread in putting together this book when you're looking at all of these incredible people who had such a force into the fabric of who we are as a country, a common thread between them?
Well, all these great men and women that are in the book are people that are just humans like we are, and they have their weaknesses and their foibles, and they have their strengths. And it's a great way to understand what humans are like in the past if you read these kind of biographies. Now, what this book is a kind of a edited version of the interviews. So it's a relatively easier way to read about Abraham Lincoln or George Washington than reading a definitive biography. I would certainly recommend the definitive biography, but if one doesn't have the time, you can read the transcripts of these edited interviews and get a fairly good sense of Washington or Lincoln or whatever president you might be interested in.
What for you was one of the most meaningful things that you found in your historic revelations? Is there anything that stood out that just resonated with you where you said, this touches me to my core?
Well, it's tempting to say that I have some fresh idea that no one else has, but my idea is similar to many other people. By far the greatest president we ever had was Abraham Lincoln. A brilliant man, though not educated really in a traditional sense. He held the country together. And I think most other people would have said, I'm not going to fight the South, let them go their way. By holding the country together, he made it possible for the United States to survive. It was a tragic war. 600,000 people were killed in combat. But in the end, the country survived and became the most powerful country in the world, and I think a country that is the best country in the world in which to live. I think Lincoln was just a giant among men, and I think no one else probably could have done that. And so when you read about Lincoln, you realize how great he really was.
Bob Woodward talks about Richard Nixon, which I found fascinating, considering he was part of that coverage of the Watergate scandal. Why do you think that he chose to do, or did you ask him to do Richard? And
yes. Well, he's best known for that. And for those who may not know, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein were young Washington Post reporters, very young, late 20s, early 30s, and they uncovered the scandal of Watergate, ultimately leading to Nixon's resignation. Interestingly, Bob Woodward tried for many, many years after Nixon left the White House to meet with him, talk to him, but he never talked to him in his life, never met him. But he was responsible, probably more than any other person, for uncovering the facts that led to Nixon's resignation. And it's a sad situation when a president has to resign. That was the first time that ever happened. Bob Woodward did this by indefatigable reporting. He just kept going after sources, and he developed a way of doing this that really is now the envy of all other reporters.
Do you think that there will ever be reporting like that again, or have we lost faith in the ability to get true facts?
There's no doubt that many people today see the news media as so-called fake media or being biased, and there's no doubt as well that some of the media is biased. And today I wonder whether Bob Woodward, if he was operating today, could do the same things he did in the 1970s. The media has become either left or right. Very few are right down the middle, and therefore I think it might be harder to do what Bob did.
Fast forward 50 to 100 years from now, who will we be talking about like this book talks about the men of the past? Who will be the people of the past then?
Well, there's no doubt that we'll have a woman be president of the United States at some point, and I think 100 years from now we'll look back and say, well, why didn't we have women be president earlier? Because they did, and this woman did a very, very good job, or maybe more than one woman. I think we will also have people who have some disabilities. They might serve as president of the United States as well, physical disabilities like FDR.
Well, David, I know you have to get going. Thank you so much for being with us today and bringing up this amazing story, a look back at the American story, conversations with master historians. Thank you for putting it together and for being such an incredible philanthropist, and we look forward to having you back on the show. Stick around. There is more coming up right here. We're going to talk about caregiving, the stress of it, and also National Geographic, their amazing kids series. There's a new one out, and we'll be talking all about it next.